I had just forked into a plate of scrambled eggs that Fritz could have patented when the doorbell rang. The bell has a certain pitch, polite, sharp, insistent, that tells you before you even move that life in the brownstone is about to get less comfortable. Wolfe was upstairs communing with the orchids, which meant the job of interruption fell to me. The woman on the stoop was tall, composed, and wrapped in a fur collar that had survived at least one war. She wasn't shivering, which told me either the cab heater had been good or her nerves ran hotter than most. Her eyes went over me with the kind of quick inventory usually reserved for diamonds in a pawn shop. "Mr. Wolfe," she said. It wasn't a request. I gave her the once-over and the corner of my mouth twitched. "He's in. Whether he's available is a wager I wouldn't recommend, but since you've braved the snow, come in." Inside, she handed me a card heavy enough to anchor a battleship. Mrs. Harold P. Meriden. The name carried a faint echo, though not one that had ever passed my desk with a bouquet attached. I relieved her of the fur and steered her to Wolfe's office. Wolfe was in his chair, naturally, dictating nothing and waiting for the day to keep its distance. He didn't look at her until Fritz slipped in with a beer and vanished. When he did, it was one of those half-lidded glances that told you he had already ranked her in his mental filing cabinet. "Mr. Wolfe," she said again, this time with something under the polish, urgency, maybe, or desperation carefully wrapped. "Sit," Wolfe told her. He closed his book with one thumb and placed it on the desk. "You have come uninvited. Explain." She sat, and out came a slim envelope from her handbag. She laid it down like she was handling a snake. I leaned over Wolfe's shoulder. The paper inside was torn from a ledger book, the neat columns filled with names and figures. I didn't need a second look before the picture sharpened. Blackmail. "My husband's name is there," she said, voice tight, "along with others you would recognize. This page arrived by post. No note, no demand. Yesterday morning a call came. A man said the book was complete, and unless payments resumed, copies would be sold to the press." Wolfe's lids drooped. "You say payments resumed, which implies they had ceased. When and why?" Her jaw trembled before she clamped it. "My husband stopped last year. He said he would not be drained further. The calls began again 2 days ago." I glanced at Wolfe. He hadn't twitched, but I knew the spark had caught. Blackmail is a word he hates more than exercise. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you cannot be bought," she said. "And if this spreads, half the city's power will collapse. My husband will not go to the police. I will not live under it. Stop this." Wolfe closed his eyes. "You will give me the full circle. Every name, every tie. I require context." She hesitated. "If those names leave this room, they will not," Wolfe said. Her chin lifted and she nodded. "You will be paid." He waved that aside like it was smoke. "Fouille. Blackmail offends me. Mr. Goodwin." "Yes, sir." "You will determine who delivered this page. Begin at once." I just opened my notebook when the bell rang again. Fritz returned with the news. "Inspector Kramer, that was 2 interruptions in one breakfast, which is some kind of record." Kramer barged in like always, cigar smoke and irritation wrapped in a coat. He stopped short when he saw Mrs. Meriden. "Hell," he muttered. "I thought so." He shoved a folded sheet on Wolfe's desk. "We pulled this off a stiff this morning. Male, mid-30s, no ID, skull cracked neat. Guess what was in his pocket?" Another ledger page. Mrs. Meriden gasped, covering her mouth. I leaned in. Different names, same columns. Kramer chewed his cigar. "Looks like your lady friend here isn't the only one holding scraps. Wolfe, you're knee-deep in it already. That body's tied to her ledger, and I want answers before you start spinning webs." Wolfe's mouth curved a fraction, not quite a smile. "Archie," he said, "we begin." Mrs. Meriden hadn't moved since Kramer's little performance, her eyes fixed on the ledger page as though the columns might start bleeding ink. Wolfe let the silence linger long enough to make her twitch, then lifted a finger toward the page like it was evidence in a courtroom. "Madam," he said, "if you expect me to intervene, I require the circle complete. Every name, every connection. Do not insult me by omission. The integrity of this inquiry depends upon it." Kramer puffed a lungful of smoke. "If you're thinking of playing lawyer, Wolfe, forget it. This is police business. That stiff in the morgue is a homicide, and if she's tied to it—" "Be silent," Wolfe told him, voice cool enough to frost the windows. "You have your corpse. I will find the hand that produced it." Kramer's eyes bulged, but he clamped his jaw and ground the cigar between his teeth. Mrs. Meriden drew in a breath, reached into her bag, and pulled out a folded sheet of her own notes. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "My husband told me the names. He thought to frighten me into loyalty. If it ruins him now, so be it." She slid the paper toward Wolfe. I picked it up and read aloud, jotting them in my notebook as I went. Harold P. Meriden, financier. Her husband, obviously, with a reputation for backing ventures that always came out smelling like roses, even when everyone else reeked of fertilizer. Raymond Thorne, a former associate of Meriden's, scar on his cheek, booted from the firm years ago under a cloud of scandal. Known for keeping grudges the way other men keep cufflinks. Senator James Kelleher, name familiar to anyone who read headlines about campaign slush funds. If the figures matched, he'd been greasing wheels with more than patriotism. Edwin Kellerman, Broadway impresario, known for champagne openings and bankrupt closings, somehow always bouncing back with a new investor. And last, a name scribbled faintly, Carl Eldon, listed as assistant to Thorne. That one came with no gloss, no social standing, just an echo in the corner. Wolfe leaned back, fingertips meeting in front of his vest. There, the circle. His eyes drifted closed, as though tasting the list for seasoning. Kramer snapped. "That's supposed to help me? Half the city's stuffed shirts are in it up to their ears, and one dead man already. I'll need more than names scrawled on a paper." "You will have more," Wolfe said. "Archie." "Already on it," I told him, sliding my notebook shut. "You want me to start with the corpse, the club, or the husband?" "Begin with the dead," Wolfe instructed. "Ralston, his associates, his lodgings, his habits, then Thorne. A scarred man leaves scars wherever he goes. Bring me what they tell you." Mrs. Meriden stood, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. "I've done what I can. If you fail—" Wolfe cut her off with a dismissive flick of his hand. "If I fail, madam, you may find solace in the press, for they will have the ledger. That is the alternative. Good day." She looked like she might snap back, but instead she swept out, spine stiff, as if the brownstone air offended her. Kramer stomped after, muttering about Wolfe's arrogance and the DA's ulcers. When the door shut, Wolfe sighed heavily, like Atlas shaking his shoulders. "Blackmail," he said. "A sordid trade, and men pay more dearly for secrecy than for guilt. Bah, do not dawdle, Archie. I expect a report before dinner." That was my cue. I started with the morgue. Ralston's body lay stretched out like a warning label. Early 30s, nothing remarkable about him but the neat crack to the skull and the ledger page in his pocket. The attendant remembered a watch chain, cheap, and a torn matchbook with the name of a midtown cabaret. That smelled like a trail. Next stop was the boarding house where he'd lived. The landlady had a mouth like a clothes wringer, but after I flashed credentials and a grin, she turned loose the details. Quiet tenant, always paid in cash, spent evenings making calls from the payphone on the corner. No visitors, save one. A thin fellow, nervous eyes, always tapping his fingers. That matched the faint fifth name on Mrs. Meriden's list, Eldon. I let Saul Panzer know to shadow the phone booth Ralston used. If any ghosts were still haunting the place, Saul would net them. Then I went uptown to check on the scarred man himself. Raymond Thorne wasn't hard to spot. Scar down his cheek like a knife had signed his name there, hair slicked back with the cheap shine of a man who wanted to look expensive. He was at a midtown club, drinking with two hangers-on, loud enough to register from the curb. I approached, introduced myself, and got the expected snarl. Ralston. I knew him. Errand boy. Ledger. My idea. I bought the books, told him to keep records. But the fool thought he could sell pieces off to line his own pocket. I warned him, don't carve the pie before it's baked. Where were you when his head got cracked? I asked. Thorne sneered. Not with him. Ask anyone here. I was losing at cards till midnight. It was too smooth, too quick. A man with a scar like that didn't keep himself out of trouble. I made notes, filed his expression away, and left him muttering into his glass. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was dark, the snow turning the sidewalks into a skating rink. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, fingers tented, waiting for my report. I laid out the morgue, the boarding house, the matchbook, the nervous assistant, and Thorne's neat little confession of involvement. Wolfe's eyes opened just enough to glimmer. So, Ralston kept the record. Thorne claimed authorship, but entrusted it to another hand, then feared the hand would betray him. Murder ensued. Yes. I said, that's a theory. You want facts. Indeed. You will proceed to Mr. Kellerman tomorrow. A man of theatre hides nothing, least of all his debts. Should I wear my tux? Phooey, wear competence. Bring me results. And with that, Wolfe rang for Fritz to bring beer, which was his way of dismissing me without dismissal. The circle was drawn. Now it was time to see which of them would hang themselves with their own line. The next morning I hit Broadway in daylight, which is always a mistake. Broadway in daylight is like running into a stage actress in curlers. No glitter or grind. The marquees were dead bulbs. The sidewalks smelled of wet plaster and old perfume, and the only actors around were managers trying to look solvent. Edwin Kellerman's office was 3 flights above a shuttered ticket agency, and the stairs had more gum than carpet. Kellerman answered the door himself, which told me his staff had shrunk to 1 man, and that man was him. He was tall and wiry, hair slicked down in a way that screamed grease more than grooming, and his face had that nervous energy that makes you think of a sparrow eyeing a cat. Mr. Goodwin, he said, almost too quick. I thought you might come. Everyone's talking. Talking about what? I asked, stepping in. The ledger, the blackmail, Ralston's death. Word runs faster through the theatre crowd than on a ticker tape. He paced back to his desk and lit a cigarette, hands trembling just enough to notice. Ralston approached me last month. Said he had accounts, figures, proof of loans that weren't loans. He waved my name like a club. I told him to go to hell. Then he said there were copies. Copies, Goodwin. He said he'd scatter them like playbills if I didn't pay. Did you? His mouth twisted. Do I look like a man who pays? I'm ruined either way. If the papers print my name, investors scatter. If I hand over money, it's gone in a week. He was squeezing me dry for a play that would never open. That was as close to a motive as anyone needed. I wrote it down, watched him fidget, and asked, Where were you the night Ralston got his head bashed? At a rehearsal. He jabbed his cigarette at a calendar on the wall. Ask anyone there. 20 people saw me. Too many witnesses to fake, but desperation does odd things. I let it simmer while I checked the office. Bills stacked like scenery, a poster for a show that had closed in 3 nights, and 1 locked drawer that Kellerman hovered near like a hen. He saw me glance, smiled thinly, and said, Contracts, which probably meant IOUs. I left him sweating into his cigarette and headed for my next stop, Senator Kelleher. If Kellerman was all nerves, Kelleher was the opposite. Smooth, polished, a man who thought scandals existed for other people. His brownstone in the Upper East Side was a shrine to expensive wood and bad portraits. He shook my hand like we were at a campaign rally. "Mr. Goodwin, I expected Nero Wolfe would send you." "Smart man," I said. "Saves me the trouble of introductions. Let's skip the speeches. Ralston waved your name in a ledger." "True." The senator's smile didn't falter, but the eyes went hard. "Ralston was a nuisance. He brought me a page, said it proved contributions that never appeared on official filings. He thought I'd be frightened. I told him I was not. And then he left. I did not see him again." He walked me to a cabinet, poured a glass of rye for himself, and leaned against the desk. "Mr. Goodwin, men like Ralston thrive on bluff. I never paid him a cent." "That's noble," I said, "but bluff doesn't usually end with a cracked skull." Kelleher sipped. "And you think I wielded the weapon?" His smile returned, thin as paper. "I was at a dinner with 6 colleagues that night. Check the register." Alibis were piling up like snowdrifts, maybe too neat. I filed it, thanked him for his patriotism, and left before he tried to sell me a platform. By the time I hit the street, Saul had phoned in a report. He'd been tailing the phone booth Ralston used. A thin, twitchy fellow had shown up twice, loitered, then left when no one came. Saul's description matched the boarding house landlady's nervous-eyed man. Carl Eldon had graduated from a faint scrawl on Mrs. Merridin's list to a figure walking in daylight. I called Wolfe from a corner drugstore. "Our friend Eldon's still alive and twitching. Saul's got eyes on him. Meanwhile, Kellerman swears Ralston tried to blackmail him, and Kelleher says the same. Neither admits to paying. Both had alibis long enough to stretch across the Brooklyn Bridge." Wolfe's voice rumbled through the receiver. "Alibis are worth no more than the mouth that utter them. The essential point remains. Ralston did not originate the ledger, but he possessed it. He threatened. Someone silenced him to obtain exclusivity." "Continue." "Where to?" "Thorne, the scarred man. He purchased the books. Ascertain whether he also purchased Ralston's loyalty or his death." I hung up, flagged a cab, and pointed it downtown. Thorne lived in a furnished apartment that smelled of smoke and resentment. He opened the door with a glare, scar twisting as though it shared his temper. "You again," he growled. "Me again," I said. "Ralston's dead. You were his partner in this ledger game. Care to explain?" He slammed the door wider and stalked back inside. "Partner? Pfui. He was supposed to record, nothing more. I bought the books, I set the scheme, I told him to mark every payment. But then he grew ideas. Thought he could sell pieces to fatten his wallet. That ledger was mine, Goodwin. He betrayed me." "And where were you when his head got cracked?" "In this room with 2 friends and a deck of cards. They'll tell you." Same refrain. Alibis and denials. But there was one difference. On his table, half buried under papers, lay a fresh ledger book, blank pages waiting. I picked it up. "New project." He snatched it back. "Old habits." It didn't need a label. He was planning another run, with or without Ralston. I left him pacing, called Saul again, and set him to keep an eye on Eldon. If Ralston's assistant held the real strings, he'd lead us to them. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, eyes closed, lips moving in silent equations. I laid the day's haul before him. Kellerman's panic, Kelleher's smooth denial, Thorne's claim of ownership, Eldon's shadow. Wolfe opened his eyes, at last. "Sir," the circle tightens. "Ralston held the record, but not the mind." Thorne conceived. Kellerman and Kelleher feared exposure. Eldon lurked, and Harold Merridin. "Still missing from the dance," I said. "You want me to call him in?" "Not yet." Wolfe leaned back, eyes narrowing. First, I'll let them sweat. Pressure ferrets out truth. Tomorrow, we proceed. He reached for his beer. I shut my notebook. The game was on, and the brownstone was the stage. Fritz had just cleared away Wolfe's empty sauerkraut plate when the phone rang. Wolfe barely twitched, which meant it was my job. On the other end was Saul, and his voice had that steady current that tells you he's got something worth reporting. "Your twitchy fellow, Eldon," Saul said, "paid a visit to a print shop on 38th this afternoon. He wasn't there long, but the proprietor told me he's been in twice before, asking about ledger bindings, the kind your Ralston carried. That was gold." I told Saul to keep shadowing, hung up, and turned to Wolfe. He opened one eye like a cat acknowledging a servant. "Print shop," I said. "Eldon's been sniffing around ledgers." Both eyes opened now. Wolfe sat down his fork, pressed fingertips together. Then Ralston was not merely recording, he was reproducing. "Copies?" "Precisely." Wolfe's voice thickened with disapproval. "A blackmailer rarely kills his quarry. Too much risk, too little return, but his accomplice, his assistant, could see that exclusivity meant leverage. A copy threatens value. A third party might buy one and wield it. Eldon would fear dilution. It is consistent." It was also consistent with a man desperate enough to bludgeon his own partner. I called my hat and coat back into service and headed to 38th. The shop smelled like ink and hot metal, the kind of place that eats fingernails for breakfast. The proprietor was happy to talk, once I slipped him a 10. "Yes, he came in," the man said, squinting through his spectacles. "Thin, fidgety, wanted bound ledgers, sturdy, discreet. I made up 2 last week, paid cash." "2?" I asked. He nodded. "Said it was for bookkeeping." "Ha! If you ask me, bookkeeping doesn't need 300 pages and locks on the covers." That meant at least 2 bound volumes existed beyond the scraps we'd seen. If one was in Ralston's pocket when he got his head cracked, the other was still out there, probably in Eldon's trembling hands. I carried that nugget back to Wolfe, who was in his chair with a book of Montaigne essays. He didn't close it until I laid the report down. "Pooh," he muttered. 2 copies. Fools. Every copy multiplies peril. I told you, Archie, this trade attracts idiots." "Idiots who kill," I said. "Where to next?" "The scarred man," Wolfe replied. "If Thorne purchased the books, he conceived the record. But conception without control is useless. He must have sought to retrieve it. Press him." That was my assignment, so I went back to Thorne's apartment. He opened the door slower this time, suspicion oozing like cheap cologne. "You again," he growled. "Yeah, me again," I said, stepping past him. "I just came from your friendly neighborhood print shop. Funny thing, they remember you buying ledgers. Big, sturdy, black. Same kind Ralston was scribbling in. You planning to open a stationery business?" His scar twitched as he scowled. "I bought them." "So what?" "I had him keep accounts. I wanted it tidy, neat. That was all." "Neat, huh?" I flipped my notebook. "Neat enough that when he started cutting side deals, you got sore. Maybe sore enough to cut him out for good." Thorne's fist clenched, but he didn't swing. He spat instead. "I didn't kill him. Damn fool deserved what came, but it wasn't from me. I was here with 3 men that night playing cards till dawn. I can prove it." I filed the alibi, though alibis in this case were multiplying like rabbits. "You said the ledger was yours. You still claim it?" "Of course," he snapped. "It was my plan. My idea. Without me, there is no record. Ralston was a clerk. Nothing more." I left him seething and made my way back to the brownstone. By then it was dusk, the snow outside turning grey with city soot, and Fritz had the office lamps glowing soft. Wolfe was leaning back with his eyes shut, but when I delivered the details, he stirred. "So," he said, "Thorne claims ownership. He declares Ralston subordinate, yet Ralston possessed initiative enough to duplicate the record. Eldon was present at both ends. He aided Thorne in conceiving, then Ralston in executing. A man between. That is the most dangerous creature of all, Archie. One who serves two masters, then betrays both. He was building his net already, and I could feel the string tightening. The bell rang then, sharp and urgent. Fritz appeared with a face like a man delivering sour milk. "Mr. Harold Meriden," he announced. That was a name that needed no introduction. The financier himself strode in, shoulders stiff under his coat, face pale but composed. He glanced at me, then fixed on Wolfe. "My wife was here," he said, voice clipped. "She had no right." "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "She had reason." Meriden glared, but Wolfe's bulk and calm turned him from a bull into a beetle. He dropped into the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk. "This ledger business is poison," he said. "Ralston tried me. Yes, Thorne tried me before him. I paid once. I will not again. But if my wife has involved you—" "She has," Wolfe cut in. "And I'm already involved. You will tell me what you know." Meriden's lips thinned. "I know nothing beyond this. If the ledger is real, and if my name is in it, it will destroy me. But I am not the only one. You've seen the names." "I have," Wolfe said. "And you, sir, had motive strong enough to silence Ralston if you feared exposure." Meriden leaned forward, fury in his eyes. "If I wanted him dead, he'd be dead. But I don't crack skulls. I make deals." "Yet your name was on the page," Wolfe said softly. "You're in the circle whether you will or no." Meriden stood abruptly, yanked his coat straight. "I won't play in your theater, Wolfe. If the police come for me, so be it, but I'll not sit here while you spin theories." He stormed out, slamming the door. I looked at Wolfe. "That went well," Wolfe grunted. "As expected. The guilty protest, the innocent fear. Both behave identically. It is of no consequence. We continue." Which meant the next move would tighten the snare, and the brownstone would see more company before the ledger gave up its last page. Meriden's slam still rattled the hinges when Wolfe reached for his beer. He lifted it halfway, stopped, and gave me a look that said a decision had just landed like a brick in his head. "Archie," he said, "it is time to force the circle inward." That meant my evening wasn't going to be spent at a movie house with a leggy blonde. "Force how? You planning a dinner party?" Hidatwe grunted. "I will summon them, all. Thorne, Kellerman, Kelleher, Meriden, and the nervous assistant. The ledger is the bait, and my office the trap." I arched a brow. "You expect them to march right into the brownstone and spill their secrets?" "They already have," Wolfe said, gesturing at the papers on his desk. "In fragments, in omissions, in contradictions. Now we arrange the pieces. Call them tomorrow." So I spent the next morning leaning on the phone, arranging appointments nobody wanted. Thorne cursed and threatened. Kellerman whimpered. Kelleher tried to duck with talk of Senate schedules, and Meriden simply said nothing before slamming the receiver. But they all agreed, eventually. That's the Wolfe effect. Once his voice enters the room, you don't dodge it. By noon the next day, the brownstone was primed like a powder keg. Wolfe sat in his chair, mountain of calm, and I held the door as the suspects filed in one by one. Thorne came first, scar twitching, coat collar up, looking ready to punch the air. Kellerman followed, sweating through his tie, eyes darting like a sparrow. Kelleher swept in like he was entering a committee hearing, smooth and contemptuous. Meriden was last, jaw tight, lips white. Behind him trailed Eldon, thin and jumpy, eyes flicking around the room like he expected every corner to lunge at him. Wolfe waited until they'd taken seats in the red leather chairs and on the sofa. He didn't open with pleasantries. "You are here," he said, "because one among you killed James Ralston. You are all entangled with a ledger that records payments, favors, and corruption. Each of you had reason to fear him. Each of you lied. That got their attention. Kellerman made a sound like a strangled bird. Thorne cursed. Kelleher lit a cigar with deliberate calm. Meriden leaned forward, fists clenched on his knees. Eldon just twitched. Wolfe lifted a finger. "Mr. Thorne, you declared the ledger your idea, that Ralston was but your clerk. Yet you denied seeking to control him when he threatened to sell. Inconsistency." Thorne's scar writhed. "I didn't kill him. I wanted him alive. The ledger was useless without him." Wolfe inclined his head and turned to Kellerman. "Mr. Kellerman, you claimed you never paid. Yet records show your accounts emptied thrice on suspicious dates. You lied." Kellerman blurted, I only paid once. To stop the presses, I thought. But it didn't stop." Wolfe let him collapse into silence and swung to Kelleher. "Senator, your alibi is robust, yet too robust. 6 witnesses, each eager to affirm your innocence. Too much convenience, the odor of orchestration." Kelleher blew smoke. "Accusations don't equal evidence. You think I would risk my career with a murder charge? I had no need. I never paid, never will." Meriden barked a laugh. "Liar, you paid. We all paid." That broke the room into shouting. Kelleher red-faced, Kellerman stammering, Thorne cursing, Meriden snarling. Eldon stayed quiet, hands twitching on his knees. I watched him, not the noise. Wolfe watched him too. "Archie," Wolfe said suddenly, voice cutting through the din, "bring the envelope." I went to the drawer and pulled out the page Mrs. Meriden had given us, plus the one from Ralston's pocket. I laid them on Wolfe's blotter. He tapped them with a forefinger. "These are fragments. Copies. Proof of duplication. The original remains missing. Without it, each of you remains at risk. Only one person benefits from exclusive possession. Only one feared dilution so much that he struck Ralston dead." The room hushed. Every eye followed his hand as it moved, deliberately, to the far end of the row where Eldon sat. Eldon flinched. "Me? No, I only delivered messages. I was nothing." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, voice iron. "You were everything. The bridge between Thorne and Ralston. You carried notes. You arranged meetings. You procured the ledgers. You alone knew where the book was at all times. And when Ralston threatened to scatter it, you killed him and took it. The twitch of your fingers, the sweat on your brow, the very fact you lingered near the phone booth after his death, these betray you." Eldon shot up, face wild. "He would have ruined it. All of it. I kept it safe." Kramer, who had slipped in quietly behind me for the show, stepped forward. "That's enough." He clamped a hand on Eldon's shoulder. Eldon sagged like a puppet with its strings cut. The others sat stunned. Kellerman wept into his hands. Kelleher cursed. Thorne ground his teeth, and Meriden stared straight ahead, cold as marble. Wolfe leaned back. "You see, gentlemen, each of you bound yourself to a sordid scheme. Each of you feared exposure, but only one of you took a life. That is the distinction, and that is why Mr. Eldon will not leave here free." Kramer cuffed him and marched him out, barking at the others to stay put for questioning later. When the door shut behind them, Wolfe exhaled, long and slow, and reached for his beer. "Archie, remove this refuse. Their stench clutters my office. I herded the 3 of them out like bad actors after a dress rehearsal. They didn't fight me. Outside, the snow had thickened, and their figures blurred into the storm like they were already half erased. Back inside, Wolfe rang for Fritz. "Bring the sauerbraten. I am fatigued." I dropped into my chair. So that's that. Ledger still missing, suspects still sweating, but Eldon's in irons. "You sure you don't want to go into show business? You've got the timing for it." "Pfui," Wolfe said. He closed his eyes again. "Let the law flounder in its paperwork. I have orchids." The snow had thickened by the time Kramer carted Eldon out, and for once Wolfe let the silence linger instead of chasing it off with burr. He sat there with his eyes closed, lips pressed into a line as though the taste of the room still offended him. I let him have a minute, then asked, "Satisfied?" "No," he said, opening his eyes. "Not remotely." That was Wolfe. You could gift wrap a killer, hand him over to Kramer, and Wolfe would still find the symmetry lacking. "The ledger is absent," he went on. "The original. Without it, the circle remains unbroken. Their names still drift in rumor, their motives still ferment. Eldon is a killer, but he was not clever enough to exploit the ledger fully. Therefore, another hand may still maneuver. You think he had a partner? Not precisely. Accomplice, perhaps. Or rival. It will emerge. Archie, tomorrow you will pursue Kellerman. His panic is too raw, too ungoverned. I wish to see it tested." That meant another trip to the Broadway shadows. I went the next day, dodging slush puddles, and found Kellerman in his office again. He was worse than before. Suit wrinkled, tie loose, ashtray piled high. "Mr. Goodwin," he blurted, jumping up. "They said Eldon did it, that he killed Ralston. Is it true?" "Kramer thinks so," I told him. "But Wolfe doesn't. He thinks the ledger's still at large." Kellerman swallowed hard, sank into his chair. "It's still out there. I know it. Ralston promised me he'd keep my name safe, that he'd destroy the pages once I paid. But he lied. He said he had duplicates. Copies. If someone finds those..." His voice cracked. "You sound like a man who knows exactly what's missing." He pressed his temples with trembling fingers. "I don't know. I don't. But if the original surfaces, I'm finished. Do you understand?" Finished. I understood. What I didn't understand was how deep he was already in. I left him chewing his nails and crossed town to check on Kelleher. The senator received me with his usual polish, offering bourbon like I was a voter. "Archie," he said, voice smooth, "this business must end. If Eldon killed Ralston, then the case is concluded. Wolfe should let it die." "Wolfe doesn't let things die until they stop moving," I said, "and the ledger's still kicking." Kelleher's smile thinned. "The press would salivate. Imagine, my name on a list beside men of lesser integrity. That's what Ralston threatened. He said he would release the book to reporters unless I met his price. I refused. I will always refuse. But the damage, if it spreads, would be permanent." "Permanent enough to tempt murder?" I asked. He set down his glass, eyes narrowing. "I am not a fool, Mr. Goodwin. My power rests on reputation. To bloody my hands would erase everything. No, my defense is denial, not violence. I filed that as the kind of denial that often covers more dirt than a shovel. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe had already summoned Thorne. The scarred man sat in the red chair, glowering at me as I came in. "Your clerk Eldon has been arrested," Wolfe told him. "He killed Ralston, so the police believe. Do you accept this?" Thorne spat on the rug, which made Fritz blanch. He was nothing without me. A rat. If he killed Ralston, it was because he wanted what was mine. "Yours," Wolfe echoed. "Yes, you have said so repeatedly. Yet if it were yours, why do you not possess it?" Thorne's scar writhed. "Because the damn fool hid it, or Eldon snatched it. I should have burned the whole thing before it got this far." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "Destruction, convenient when truth grows heavy." Thorne shot to his feet, fists clenched. "You think I killed him? You're wrong. But if that book appears, you'll see my name and maybe I'll go down with it. But I didn't crack his skull." "Archie," Wolfe said quietly. "Remove him." I steered Thorne out before he tried breaking something fragile. When I returned, Wolfe was leaning back, lids half shut. "You see, Archie, each trembles, each protests, each declares innocence, yet all cling to the ledger like drowning men to driftwood. It is intolerable." Then what's the move? I asked. Wolfe's gaze sharpened. Pressure. We hold the scraps. Pages torn. Proof of existence. We possess Eldon's guilt. Yet we lack the fulcrum. Tomorrow, summon them all. Again, this time, with Saul present, the storm will crest. That was Wolfe's way of saying the fireworks were coming. He rang for beer. I poured one for myself, ignoring his frown, and made a note in my book. Tomorrow the suspects return, and the brownstone would host another circus. That night I dreamed of ledger pages fluttering like snow, each name a wound waiting to bleed. They came back to the brownstone like prisoners called to a parole board. Fritz showed them into the office one by one, and I kept count in my head like a ringmaster checking the acts before the curtain. Kellerman was the first, pale and damp, his tie crooked. He went straight to the corner of the sofa and sat like he expected it to collapse. Kelleher came next, brisk and polished, shaking snow from his hat with a little flick that was too studied to be casual. Thorne followed, shoulders hunched, scar twitching as though it had its own pulse. Last was Meriden, grim and cold, the kind of cold that money can buy but won't ever thaw. They didn't speak to each other, which suited Wolfe. He waited until Fritz withdrew and then let the silence lengthen. If silence were a tool, Wolfe owned the patent. Finally, he raised a hand, and the room stilled further. "You know why you are here," he said. "The matter has not concluded. Mr. Eldon killed Ralston, yes, but the ledger remains absent. Its absence continues your peril. Until it is recovered and placed under my authority, each of you is exposed." That landed. Kellerman whimpered. Thorne swore. Kelleher scowled, and Meriden clenched his jaw. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was the equivalent of shouting. "I have fragments," he continued, gesturing at the high pages on his desk. "But the whole remains hidden. One of you knows where, one of you profits by its concealment, and one of you, perhaps the same, abetted Eldon, directly or indirectly. This evening I will know who." That was my cue. Saul emerged from the hall where he'd been waiting, his hat pulled low. He nodded at Wolfe, then planted himself near the door. Silent, steady, the way Saul always was. If someone tried to bolt, they'd find out how solid that quiet frame could be. Kelleher cleared his throat. "This is absurd, Wolfe. You cannot hold us here like suspects in a play." "I do not hold you," Wolfe said calmly. "Your own fear does. If you leave, you invite exposure." "Sit." And Kelleher sat. Wolfe turned to Thorne. "You conceived the record, yet you let a mere clerk control it. Why?" Thorne's scar writhed. "I needed someone with neat handwriting. I'm not made for books." "Pray," Wolfe rumbled. "You needed a shield, someone disposable, and yet you let him copy. That was folly." Thorne glared but said nothing. Next, Wolfe faced Kellerman. "You claim to have paid once. But you lied. You paid thrice. The record proves it." "Why?" Kellerman broke. His voice rose, shrill. "Because he wouldn't stop. I thought if I paid again he'd leave me alone, but it only got worse. I was ruined. Ruined." He buried his face in his hands. Meriden snorted. "Weak fool." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Meriden. "And you, sir? You professed disdain, yet your wife brought me the first page. She feared for you enough to defy you. Why?" Meriden's eyes burned. "Because she doesn't understand. I stopped paying. I would never resume. I'd sooner burn the whole thing." "Which you may have done," Wolfe said, voice low. "If the ledger has vanished, perhaps it rests already in ashes." Meriden surged half out of his chair. "I did no such thing." "Sit," Wolfe said. And Meriden sat. Finally, Wolfe turned to Kelleher. "Senator, you insist on your immunity. You say you never paid, yet your name was inscribed, your meetings noted, your numbers precise. How if you never participated?" Kelleher's face tightened. "Ralston invented it. He wanted leverage. He forged my name to inflate his list." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Forgery does not pay bills. Only coin does, and your coin was tallied. The senator had no answer. The room swirled with their denials, their protests, their overlapping noise. Wolfe raised a hand again, and the noise died. "Enough," he said. "You are each culpable in corruption, but only one of you partnered Eldon in murder." That statement froze them. Kellerman's hands shook. Thorne's scar twitched. Kelleher's lips pressed thin. Meriden stared straight ahead. Wolfe lifted one of the ledger scraps. Ralston kept meticulous order, names, dates, amounts. But on this page, he tapped the column. There is a correction, a sum adjusted. Only one man in this room benefits from that adjustment. Only one who knew the figures intimately enough to alter them. His eyes closed, then opened like shutters. "Mr. Meriden." Meriden shot to his feet. "Lie." "No," Wolfe said. "The ink betrays you. You altered the entry yourself, reducing the amount you paid. You thought no one would notice. But Eldon noticed. He saw that you lied to your own blackmailer, and so you joined him, briefly, in hiding the book, until Ralston threatened exposure. Then Eldon struck, at your encouragement." Kellerman gasped. Thorne cursed. Kelleher leaned forward, eyes glittering. "You cannot prove this," Meriden shouted. "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "I already have." "Saul?" Saul stepped forward, reached into his coat, and pulled out a bound black ledger. He laid it on Wolfe's desk. The print shop proprietor recognized Meriden. Saul said quietly. "He ordered one of the ledgers himself. Paid cash. Picked it up 2 nights before Ralston died." Meriden's face drained of color. He looked at the book as though it were a coffin. Wolfe tapped it once, then leaned back. "There is your proof. You are finished." The room held its breath. Meriden swayed, then sank back into his chair. His fight was gone. Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Inspector Kramer will be summoned. Archie, telephone him. The matter now belongs to the law." Meriden sat there like a statue gone brittle. The blood drained from his face. His hands pressed into his knees as if holding himself together. The ledger Saul had laid down on Wolfe's desk might as well have been a live grenade. Nobody spoke, not even Kellerman, who usually needed no invitation to babble. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock and the faint creak of Thorne's jaw grinding. Wolfe let the silence do its work. His lids lowered halfway, his lips pressed into the familiar line, and I could see the trap tightening though he hadn't moved a muscle. At last, Meriden found his voice. "You can't know what that book proves," he said, low and hoarse. "You can't." "I do know," Wolfe said, calm as a glacier. "Because I understand human impulse. You ordered your own ledger to monitor your place in the scheme, but you altered it to suit your vanity and your greed. Eldon saw, and thus you bound yourself to him. You wished to reduce your exposure. He wished to increase his control. Together, you concealed. Then, when Ralston became inconvenient, you condoned his elimination." Meriden surged up, fists trembling. "That's invention." "Phooey, it is deduction," Wolfe said. "And it is corroborated. Saul, explain." Saul's quiet tone carried more weight than a gavel. The proprietor kept a note in his ledger of sales. The order for Meriden's book is in his hand, dated and signed Mary. He remembered the customer because he complained about the quality of the clasp. That customer was you. Meriden sat down again, harder, this time as if the chair had dragged him into it. Kelleher gave a short, sharp laugh. "So the great financier gets caught scribbling in a blackmailer's notebook." "Perfect." Thorne snarled. "You think this clears you, Senator? You were just as deep. Every damn one of you was." "Enough," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through like a blade. "This is not a forum for recriminations. You will all answer to the law for corruption, but only one of you bears the taint of blood. That is the matter at hand." Kellerman twitched, his damp face gleaming. If Eldon killed him, then why pin it on Meriden now? Because, Wolfe said, leaning forward slightly. Eldon's hand swung the weapon, but Meriden's will guided it. A nervous assistant does not strike unless emboldened. He needed assurance. He needed protection. And Meriden, desperate to keep his secret and his ledger safe, provided it. That statement dropped into the room like lead. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, until at last Meriden rasped, "You can't prove it. There's no evidence." "There is always evidence," Wolfe murmured. "You came here tonight intending to shout down suspicion. Yet you betrayed yourself when you denied too quickly. You feared destruction by fire, though no one suggested it. That thought was yours. That is why I know you considered burning the ledger. That is why I know you handled it. And handling it ties you inexorably to Eldon, who killed to protect what you both concealed." Meriden's jaw worked, but no words came. "Archie," Wolfe said without raising his voice, "telephone Inspector Kramer. Now." I went to the phone on my desk, dialed the homicide line, and when Kramer's gravel bark came on, I told him to bring his hat and a pair of bracelets. "Wolfe's got something for you," I said. By the time Kramer arrived, coat dripping, cigar clenched, the suspects were still in their seats, frozen like schoolboys caught with stolen apples. Fritz let the inspector in with a frown that suggested he'd already resigned himself to another round of smoke in the curtains. Kramer stomped into the office. "This better be worth the call, Wolfe." His eyes landed on the ledger, then on Meriden. "Hell, I should have guessed." "You should have," Wolfe said coolly. "Mr. Meriden colluded with Eldon in concealing and exploiting the ledger. He abetted the crime, and his guilt will stand scrutiny." "Take him." Meriden bolted upright. "You can't. This is slander." Kramer shoved him back with a hand to the chest and snapped the cuffs on before the man had finished. "Save it for the DA." He yanked him up again, ignoring his protests, and jerked his head at me. "I'll want statements from all of them. Tomorrow." "Gladly," I said. "I'll write it up in my best copperplate." Kramer marched Meriden out, leaving the others looking hollowed. Kellerman sagged like a sack. Thorne scowled at the floor, and Kelleher lit another cigar with hands that weren't as steady as he wanted them to be. Wolfe ignored them all, closing his eyes as if the room had finally gone quiet enough. I moved to clear the desk. "So that's it. Meriden goes down, Eldon swings, and the ledger's safe in your drawer." "No," Wolfe said, eyes still closed. "Not yet. The ledger's value lies not in its existence, but in its use. Until the authorities decide how to wield it, corruption will fester. But our task is concluded. The killer is unmasked. The rest is politics, which bores me." "Yeah, but it'll sell newspapers," I said. Wolfe snorted. "Phooey." He reached for his beer. Fritz appeared with a tray, as if summoned by ritual, and set down cold cuts and mustard. Wolfe took one look, sighed, and pushed the ledger farther from him, as though it carried a stench he wanted no part of. I sat back, watching the suspects stew in their silence. The case wasn't done for the city, but it was done for us. Wolfe had drawn the net, sprung it, and let the fish thrash until they lay still. And me? I had front row seats, as always, with the best view in the house. Kramer's footsteps had barely faded down the hall when Wolfe exhaled, long and slow, as if the departure of Harold Meriden had aired out the office. The others, Kellerman, Kelleher, and Thorne, remained planted like stone busts. Fritz lingered in the doorway with the patience of a man who'd seen worse, but his eyes made it clear he wanted the taint of the lot removed before supper. Wolfe, however, wasn't finished. "You three," he said, voice heavy, "have escaped the immediate noose. Do not delude yourselves into believing you are absolved. The ledger records what it records. The police will dissect it in due course." That struck Kellerman like a slap. He leaned forward, clutching at his knees, sweat dampening his collar. But if it goes to the police, it'll destroy us. I thought you kept these matters discreet. I keep only what serves order, Wolfe replied. Murder is disorder. It demands resolution. Your reputations are beyond my concern. Kelleher blew out smoke in a harsh puff. So you play kingmaker with our careers. Eldon's gone, Merredin's shackled, and the rest of us are left to hang in the wind while you polish your theories. Pfui, Wolfe's lip curled. Your careers crumble by your own hand, not mine. You engaged in a sordid traffic. That it is now exposed is inevitable. Thorne's scar twitched as he shifted in his chair. So you'll let the cops run with it? Then what? You think they'll leave you alone, Wolfe? That book drags down senators and financiers. The whole city will come sniffing. I cut in before Wolfe let his temper, or what passed for it, erupt. He's right about one thing. The ledger's not just dynamite. It's enough to light up half the skyline. Once word leaks that it's sitting in your desk, you'll have reporters, politicians, and their lawyers scratching at the door. Wolfe closed his eyes and steepled his fingers. Then it will not sit in my desk, Archie. Fetch the safe envelope. I did as ordered, pulling a thick manila envelope from the cabinet drawer where Wolfe had already tucked the ledger. He placed the fragments, the pages Mrs. Merredin had delivered, the one from Ralston's pocket, inside, then sealed it. With a slow motion, he pushed it across the blotter. Tomorrow, Inspector Kramer will collect this, he said, with my conditions. Kelleher's eyebrows jumped. Conditions? You think the police will take dictation from you? They have before, Wolfe said flatly. And they will again. I will insist the ledger be treated as evidence only in the murder of James Ralston. Its ancillary content, its record of your indulgences and peccadilloes, will be withheld from indiscriminate release. If Kramer objects, he will find the case harder to close without my cooperation. That silenced even the senator. It was a gamble, but one Wolfe had played more than once. Withhold just enough to keep Kramer reluctantly in line, deliver the killer, and save the city the collapse of half its machinery. Kellerman looked half ready to collapse himself. You'd protect us? No, Wolfe said. I protect the balance of order. If you benefit incidentally, that is your good fortune. Do not mistake it for absolution. That was the last straw. Kellerman sagged. Kelleher ground his cigar into the tray, and Thorne swore under his breath. I took the cue and herded them toward the door. Fritz gladly relieved them of their coats, and within minutes the brownstone was rid of their stink. When I came back, Wolfe was in his chair, eyes shut, lips pursed. He looked like a man who'd eaten a meal that hadn't agreed with him. You don't look thrilled, I told him. I am not, he said without opening his eyes. We have delivered a murderer, but corruption remains. The ledger's exposure will prune some weeds, yet the roots endure. I detest unfinished work. You've said it before, I replied, settling into my chair. We're not in the reform business. We're in the business of keeping your conscience and my rent paid. One corpse, one culprit, and the rest is politics. And politics is the one thing you hate more than exercise. That got me a grunt, which was better than silence. The night passed in quiet. Fritz brought Wolfe his beer, and I typed up a clean record of statements for Kramer. Around midnight, the phone rang. Saul checking in. Eldon had confessed under pressure. He admitted striking Ralston, but denied intent to kill. He claimed Merredin had promised to shield him if he protected the book. The police were already preparing charges for both. I relayed that to Wolfe. His eyes stayed closed, but I saw the slight shift of his chest. Relief, maybe, or resignation. Morning brought a slate sky and the thud of newspapers on the stoop. I grabbed one and brought it in with the coffee. The headline stretched across the page. Financier held in ledger murder scandal. The article spilled names like broken glass, most of them suspects we'd seen sweat in the office. Kramer had done his part. just enough detail for the story, without unleashing the whole ledger. Wolfe's conditions had been honored, at least for now. I read it aloud, letting the sarcasm drip. They've painted you as the reluctant genius again, the reclusive Nero Wolfe forced into the open by civic duty. How does it feel to be the people's knight? Wolfe grimaced. Odious. Pass the sausages. That was Wolfe's morning commentary. I passed the sausages. As the snow tapered off outside, the brownstone regained its rhythm. Fritz humming in the kitchen, orchids upstairs, the office warm and too quiet. But under it all, the sense of unfinished echoes remained. A ledger full of sins had cracked open a murder, but the rest of the pages still glimmered with rot. I leaned back and said, "You know, the city may keep running on blackmail and bribes, but for once, the good guys scored a headline. You unmasked Meriden, nailed Eldon, and gave Kramer his killer. That counts for something." "Pfui," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. "It counts for very little, but it will suffice." The snow outside had melted into grey slush by late afternoon, but inside the brownstone the air was as taut as wire. Wolfe had returned upstairs to the orchids after breakfast, leaving me to field the phone calls that poured in like pigeons after crumbs. Reporters, political fixers, even a man claiming to represent concerned businessmen, wanted Wolfe's ear. I told them all the same thing. Wolfe was unavailable, uninterested, and unlikely to break his silence before Judgment Day. By the time he came down, round 6 o'clock, I had a list of names long enough to paper the wall. I slid it across the desk. "They're worried," I said. "Some about the ledger, some about their reputations, some about you. You're the talk of half the city." Wolfe grunted, lowering himself into his chair with the precision of a man dismounting from a throne. "Pfui, attention is a disease." He glanced at the list, then pushed it aside. "It is of no consequence. The murderer is delivered. My obligation is fulfilled." "Sure," I said, "but the ripples are still spreading. Eldon confessed to the strike. Meriden's locked up, but the rest of them are still sweating buckets. And don't forget Thorne. He's been awfully quiet since last night. Too quiet." That earned me a sidelong glance. "Explain." "Saul called while you were with the orchids. He tailed Thorne this afternoon. The man met with someone, unidentified, tall, heavy-set, outside a warehouse near the river. They exchanged a packet. Saul couldn't see what was inside." Wolfe's lips tightened. "A copy. That's my bet. If Eldon made duplicates before he got ambitious and Thorne still has one in his reach, then the game isn't over." Wolfe leaned back, fingertips pressing together. It was never over. Eldon's guilt is clear, but Ralston's ledger was a hydra. Slice one head, another emerges. Thorne will attempt to revive it. That cannot be permitted. I waited, notebook ready. Wolfe closed his eyes a moment, then opened them again, and the room felt colder. "You will go to Thorne. Tonight. Retrieve the packet." "Just like that?" "Yes. Use persuasion if possible. Force, if necessary." That was Wolfe's way of tossing the unpleasant work my way while he kept his slippers warm. I nodded, pocketed my notebook, and called Saul. An hour later, he and I were at the warehouse, shadows lengthening across the frozen river. The place smelled of rust and damp. Thorne was there, waiting with the scar twitching like a live wire. On the table between us sat a leather folder, thick enough to be dangerous. "You don't belong here, Goodwin," he said, voice low. "This isn't your business anymore. Eldon's gone. Meriden's done. Leave it." "Nice speech," I said, stepping closer. "But you and I both know that folder isn't sheet music. You planning to launch the next act of your ledger show?" His hand twitched toward it. "It's mine. I built it. I won't let it rot in some police vault." Saul moved, quiet as always, shifting to Thorne's flank. I kept my tone light but steady. Look, Thorne, you've got two choices. You can hand it over now, and Wolfe might even let Kramer hear you cooperated. Or you can make us take it, and believe me, Saul here doesn't mind the exercise. Thorne's scar writhed. His jaw worked. For a moment I thought he'd lunge, but then he slammed a fist onto the table and shoved the folder toward me. Take it then. See if I care. You think Wolfe's word will stop the city from feeding on it? You're wrong. You're all wrong. I grabbed the folder, Saul keeping his eyes steady on him. We left him pacing in circles, muttering under his breath like a man who'd lost not just the game, but the board. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, beer in hand. I set the folder on his desk. He didn't touch it right away. He stared at it as though considering whether to throw it into the fire or mount it on the wall. Finally, he flipped it open. Inside were pages neat as church ledgers, columns filled with names and figures, some familiar, some new. Worse than we'd seen before. Wolfe shut it with a snap. Idiots, he muttered. Greedy, reckless idiots. They thought duplicity would protect them. Instead, it has multiplied their danger. You want me to call Kramer again? I asked. In the morning, Wolfe said. Tonight I require quiet. I will prepare the terms. The ledger will pass to the authorities under strict limitations. Thorne's possession will be his undoing, but the greater corruption? He sighed. It is too vast. I will not try to cleanse the Augean stables. Glad to hear it, I said, loosening my tie. Because I'm not about to fetch buckets for you. But I've got to admit, Wolfe, you've outdone yourself this time. You pulled in half the city and dropped them at Kramer's feet. He closed his eyes again, weary but immovable. A distasteful feast, but necessary. Fritz appeared then with a tray, roast duck, braised red cabbage, and a bottle uncorked. Wolfe opened his eyes, sniffed, and for the first time all day, his expression softened. As I sat back and watched him lift his fork, I thought about the ledger, the names, the ruin waiting for the city once Kramer opened it up. Wolfe might claim it was distasteful, but he'd played the hand to the end. And for me, it was another story typed up with a front-row seat, watching him carve lies into confession without moving an inch from his chair. Before Wolfe could finish that first forkful of duck, the bell hit again. 3 fast jabs that said whoever was out there had decided manners were optional. Fritz went. Kramer shouldered past him like a snowplow, trailed by 2 plainclothes boys in a wind of cigar that could stun an ox. He didn't look at the tray, or at me. His eyes landed on the leather folder I'd brought back from Thorne and then climbed to Wolfe's face like they were scaling a wall they didn't like. Tell me this is the last of it, he growled. Wolfe didn't rise. He never does. He nudged the folder with one finger as if it might smudge. It is the last that concerns me. The police will glut themselves on the rest. Kramer jerked his chin. One of his men scooped the folder. Eldon has sung plenty, Kramer said. He admits clocking Ralston. He says it was a shove that went bad. You're going to tell me whether to believe him. You may believe he struck, Wolfe said. Murder can sprout from cowardice as easily as malice. It was a deliberate act to seize sole custody of the ledger. Its nature is murder, whether or not he intended poetic refinement. The law will trim the terminology. Kramer pinched ash into my tray. And Meriden? A craven, a conspirator after the fact. He handled, he hid, he preened. He did not kill. Wolfe's lids lowered. He may face charges suitable to his station, obstruction, conspiracy, what your statutes permit, but for the death of James Ralston there is only one culprit. Eldon, Kramer said. Yes, Wolfe said. I'd heard him make summations before, but this one assembled itself like a pocket watch snapping shut. He never raised his voice. He just laid the parts where they belonged. Ralston, Wolfe went on, kept the record because he enjoyed the geometry of it and the leverage it promised. He initiated copies at a printer's. Eldon carried the orders, learned the machinery, and smelled the profit of exclusivity. Thorne conceived the scheme and purchased the books, but he needed a clerk and a courier. He hired a conscience he could not afford. The moment Ralston hinted he would scatter copies, Eldon's calculus was simple. Remove the only man who knew how to reconcile entries and hold the sole readable volume himself. That is why he lurked at the phone booth after the murder, why he hovered at the boarding house, why the printer knew him better than his tailor. He killed for possession. Kramer's boys had the folder bagged. They were trying not to look impressed. Kramer didn't bother to hide it. And Thorne? A lout with notions, Wolfe said. He will answer for the extortion he orchestrated. But unless you can conjure him into that room with Ralston at the moment of the blow, he remains what he is. Architect of a racket, not a killer. Kramer chewed the thought. He'll scream you framed him by omission. He may scream in any register, Wolfe said. It will not change the notes. Kramer huffed. Fine. Eldon alone for the homicide, the others for whatever sticks. I'll take it. He hooked a thumb at his men. They moved toward the door. Then he paused, eyes narrowing. And the ledgers, this one and any others, go straight to evidence. I don't want to see them in your desk tomorrow morning with a lecture pinned on top. Wolfe's mouth twitched. Inspector, I prefer lectures to evidence. They weigh less. Kramer snorted and stamped out, taking the weather with him. Fritz reappeared to rescue the rug from fresh ash, and then vanished with his tray, delicate as a cat burglar. The house inhaled, and I joined it. So, I said, Eldon for the kill, Meriden for the shine on the rotten apple, Thorne for inventing the tree. That fixes your symmetry? Not symmetry, proportion, Wolfe said. He reached for the beer, sipped, and set it down with the deliberation of a judge returning a verdict. Murder must be named singularly. Cowardice can be mass-produced. I slid into my chair. You know, if you set that in needlepoint and hang it over the mantel, you could sell tickets. Pui. We let the quiet stretch. Upstairs, the orchids were probably arranging a reception for him. Downstairs, the radiator ticked like a discreet metronome. Outside, wheels hissed through slush. Inside, the stink of the ledger had retreated enough that you could pretend the office had never hosted a lineup of perspiring virtue. Mrs. Meriden didn't ring. She came on Fritz's heels, face pale and precise, hat settled like a verdict. She stopped just inside the door. Inspector Kramer told me, she said, about Eldon, about the ledger, about my husband. Wolfe inclined his head a quarter inch. That's generosity from him. She stood very straight. I wanted it stopped. I didn't ask for anyone to die. Madam, Wolfe said, you asked for the truth. It does not alter itself, to flatter us. Her lips trembled, then steadied. Will I be called to testify? Yes, Wolfe said. You will tell what you know, and nothing you fear. That earned him a look I hadn't seen from her before. Gratitude that refused to gush. She turned to go, hesitated, and faced me. Mr. Goodwin, thank you. Don't thank me, ma'am, I said. I only run. She left as quietly as she'd come. The door clicked with a small sound that still managed to leave a dent. Wolfe reached for the bell. I headed it off. I'll tell Fritz you want another beer, I said, and didn't move. But you might try one of those closing soliloquies. You've earned it. He regarded me, not lovingly. You're a persistent nuisance. Part of the service. He considered the ceiling. When he spoke, it was not to the plaster. Blackmail appeals to the timid and the clever, timid in paying, clever in contriving. It prospers on the fear that truth is worse than exposure. Occasionally, the clever enlist the timid and call it an enterprise. But you cannot share fear safely. Someone will decide that control requires blood. Then the matter is no longer commerce, it is murder. And murder, Mr. Goodwin, belongs to the law. That was Wolfe. Precise, cold, and right. Good, I said, because my law's simple. When the job's done, I eat. He shut his eyes with a sigh that meant I'd wrung as much philosophy out of him as the day would bear. "Fetch Fritz," he said, "and tell him no duck. Something clean." "Clean," I said, heading for the door. "He can try soap." On my way out, I glanced at the blotter, now bare. No ledger, no fragments. Just the smooth leather and Wolfe's fingers resting on it, as if the surface itself were a promise that the brownstone could shed any stink and go back to being what it was. A room where the mind did the heavy lifting and the body refused to budge. The city would chew on what we'd delivered. Kramer would grind his cigar to sawdust and pretend ulcers were a hobby. Thorne would discover that architects sometimes get bricked into their own buildings. Meriden would learn the difference between shame and consequence. And Eldon, well, Eldon had already learned that fear tightens its own noose. I told Fritz to roll another beer and something clean, and when I came back, Wolfe had not moved. He never needed to. That's the point. He sits, and the guilty do the traveling. "Anything else?" I asked. "Yes," he said without opening his eyes. Silence. I gave him exactly that, plus the beer, and took mine in the hall. The slush outside kept hissing, like a crowd that didn't know whether to boo or cheer. I wasn't worried. We'd be on to the next act when the bell remembered our address. It always does.